Hey, Angela.
Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to what's already the third conversations on decoloniality and fashion, organized by the Research Collective for Decolonizing Fashion. My name is Angela Jansen, and I am based in Belgium. And together with Erica de Geef and hopefully Shaina, who are based in South Africa, I will be convening these conversations. So for those who are new, who are recently joining us or joining us for the first time, the aims of the conversations is to experiment with an alternative way of knowledge creation and sharing through the communal, through conversation and beyond status, institutional, disciplinary, and geographical boundaries. So this requires an active participation of everyone and hopefully a monthly commitment in order to be able to build trust, respect, and eventually a strong community. We will be having or sticking to our format of 30, 30, 30. So the first 30 minutes, we have the pleasure of having conversation with Sandra Niessen, who is the author of the reading of today. And then we'll go back into our breakout rooms of 5, where you will be having a chance to conversate with 4 random people in different places of the world with unique positionalities in regards to decoloniality. And then for the last 30 minutes, we'll all come back together again in the main room where we can all have our questions and conversation with Sandra and with each other. Well, so far we have been talking about positionality and especially how everybody learns, experiences, practices decoloniality from a very unique position, especially in regard to the colonial difference. And we have also been talking, I think that's quite important to repeat, the difference between how decolonizing has been used quite, I'm not going to say randomly, but in very different ways, especially lately. It's become very popular, almost fashionable. But so how we speak about decoloniality from a very specific body of work and thinking and practicing based on the writings of some very influential and very important thinkers, mainly South African thinkers. Like we had Walter Vignolo last month, and we'll be having Rolando Vasquez with us, I believe next month. So these are some people who are very influential to our ways of thinking, or at least how we use decoloniality. Yes, and today, so we have the pleasure again of talking with Sandra Niessen, who will be talking with us about the sacrifice zones, which is, I think, a very, very important, but also very complex topic. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And I will be giving the floor to Erica, who will be formulating her first question for Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Sandra, so much for joining us today. And it really is a pleasure to have you with us. I know that you've listened in on the various conversations and our work has overlapped in so many ways. So thank you so much just for taking the time to prepare for this conversation around your work. So we did share the reading, and so I'm sure there are some other kinds of questions that will surface from this. But I thought, 2 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago, we convened a program for the first climate emergency in Maastricht, and it was together with Angela and Toby Slade, yourself, and myself, and this was at the Jan van Eyck Academy. And really, bringing together these 3 conceptual frameworks of fashion, decoloniality, and sustainability at the time, really bringing these 3 conversations together was was quite a task, finding where they overlapped and how they kind of spoke to one another. So in this reading, you propose that fashion can only become sustainable if systemic ethnic bias is both recognized and corrected. And so in other words, the route to achieving sustainability is through the decolonization of fashion. I mean, that is such an important point that you're making. And in your opening paragraph, you describe so clearly these kind of sacrifice zones as the kind of physical locations that are designated expendable for the sake of economic activity. These zones are those that entail both ecocide and racism, because the landscapes and the associated populations are destroyed in the process. I mean, it's such a difficult space to sit with, to think through the kind of fashion sacrifice zones. And really for us to think about that precariety of those zones and the complicity of industrial fashion in perpetuating what is really sacrifices. I mean, it's such an incredible scarring and pain. So I'm wondering if maybe for today you could talk to us maybe and particularly drawing on your own experience and work with the Batak people of Sumatra and Indonesia, because you draw on that quite strongly, of the epistemic, social, cultural, and even material violence that is manifest as the sacrifice for Western fashion. And then to continue along these lines to maybe, to think us through what has been and maybe continues to be sacrificed. So I know it's a big ask. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you, Erica. It is a tall order, and time is very short, but I very much welcome this opportunity. I think it's amazing to speak with colleagues from around the world, and I feel very honored to have my work as part of this series of conversations to revision fashion through a decolonial lens. And we're all, I mean, it hasn't been done before. We're the ones who are doing it in the world. And it's nice to be able to take part in that. What an insightful question, Erica. Indeed, a year and a half ago, we were still all thinking within the customary framework of fashion sustainability. We were looking at materials used, energy use, labor used, and we hadn't yet expanded that framework to include social justice. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, is it clear? Okay. Your question really asks me to dig down deep into myself to understand how this article emerged. And for me, it's not just a question of saying this and this and this have been sacrificed and this is what I've observed. I could do that, but I think that the process is really important to talk about because it wasn't just a simple writing up of empirical observation. Empirical observation occurs within conceptual frameworks. And that's why I think it's necessary to talk about the process of discovery of what is being sacrificed. I found it a difficult process to undergo. And I invite everybody present today to think with me. I know that my process is totally unique, but I know that it's also absolutely common. We're learning together, we're exploring together how decolonial theory works for us. We're all practitioners trying to build a better world. And we need a diversity of voices, as Angela said, and not a dogma. For me right now, contributing to the construction of a more sustainable world is front and center in my thinking. And maybe it is for you as well. I feel the urgency. Why was writing this article and articulating the sacrifice zone so challenging for me? I think it has to do with what decolonial theorists call erasure. In a nutshell, I was attempting to go into the conceptual territory that's usually erased from our thinking. Erasure is a conceptual trick that we play on ourselves to allow a status quo to persist. And conceptual blinkers, entrenched habits of thought, vested interest in standard conceptual frameworks, they're all really hard to break free of. Professor Orlando Vasquez, who's speaking next month, has pointed to the act of remembering as an antidote to erasure. And when we have pushed something out of our minds, remembering is a radical act. It's a facilitator of change. It dredges up other ways of thinking and being, other processes and systems, other epistemologies. My article was, in a sense, a proclamation of the value of the Indigenous. In previous meetings that we've had, we've talked about modernity incorporating a kind of temporality that demands forgetting. It places the past into a category of the irrelevance. The past lies behind us, it's unable to be recovered, forget it. Modernity asks us to think of the Indigenous as bound to disappear because it's a holdover from the past. And the engine of unilinear time is assumed to be inevitable and unstoppable. But by recognizing the importance of the Indigenous, my article is challenging the amnesia that's built into modernity. It's especially radical in the context of fashion because fashion is all about depicting modernity. Can our concept of fashion survive the recognition of the Indigenous? I personally don't see how. Not the current conception of fashion. In my article, I go even a step further and say that sustainability will depend in part on learning from Indigenous systems of sustainable clothing. And of course, this is complete heresy in the customary framework of fashion. And it felt daring and risky to write it, especially for a leading journal of fashion theory. I sensed when I was writing the piece that I was connecting dots that are usually not connected. I felt a familiar sort of schizophrenia when I was writing. There's the usual way of perceiving the world that's familiar in my day-to-day life here in Holland, familiar too through accepted fashion theory. And then there was my perception that results from my experience in Indonesia, that I didn't really have a language framework to describe, nor even much hope that people here in the global north will understand, and they usually don't. The normalcy of here in the Netherlands is so different from the normalcy there. And for a long time, I felt that the two are like two halves of a whole. And for me to understand the world, I have to go back and forth and try to come to terms with these two different normals. They're contrasting, but they're complementary. I'm sure that what I'm sensing is the upshot of that economic fact that our wealth in the global north has much to do with the exploitation of the global south. Something that we in the global north are seldom aware of, except maybe theoretically. And when I'm in Indonesia, I experience how it plays out in day-to-day life for the people, in their thoughts and their feelings, their challenges and their life choices and their perceptions of the world. And I live there in an exceedingly poor village. I put in the Google Drive, maybe you've seen it, a link to a podcast interview with Jason Hickel. He's an economic anthropologist who's talked about what he calls economic apartheid in the world. The amnesia of modernity is related to keeping the fact of this apartheid hidden, north-south. That's the boundary that the decolonial theorists know as the colonial difference. In previous writings, I've referred to dualism in fashion, that fashion carves out an us and a them, those with and those without fashion. In my article, I was trying to pull this boundary into view. Showing what's being sacrificed is showing what's being conceptually erased. At the time of writing, it felt like an appeal to my readership to please recognize this boundary because it causes so much pain and waste at 1,000 levels. I propose that fashion cannot be sustainable unless there's fairness. Sustainability can't coexist with destruction. And let's face it, the two halves are both engaged in the same struggle for sustainability on this planet. In this, we're one, not two sides of a complementary whole. That binary pertains only to the current global economic system. So, Erica, that's kind of a lengthy backdrop. Now on to the question, of what is being sacrificed. But again, I'm going to go into a backdrop. I want to look at the expression sacrifice zone first, so that everybody understands it clearly. Wikipedia tells us that the term was coined to refer to regions of the world that may be dispensed with. Initially, it was a reference to regions that would undergo permanent destruction due to atomic fallout or chemical poisoning. And it was permissible destruction in the interests of industry, economy, and power. The concept and the phenomenon of sacrifice zone should make everybody here stop for a minute and pause. The term makes thinkable and even normalizes what is absolutely scandalous, that somebody or some group has the ego and assumes the power to eradicate and destroy a part of life on Earth for the sake of short-term financial gain. Think about it. This is preposterous. It's totally unconscionable. And in fact, it's even ridiculous when you think about it, incredible in the literal sense of the word. I would argue that this concept of sacrifice zone is an expression of the kind of conceptual erasures that decolonial theorists discuss. What are the erasures in sacrifice zones? By focusing exclusively on waste regions, the term sacrifice zone leaves out, in the first place, biological diversity. You've already said that, Erica, in the region. Second, the people living there. And third, their cultures. All are conceptually erased and fully negated to the extent that they're totally expendable, off the screen, not even a blip. And I think of the Cree people in my province of Alberta who lived on the Alberta tar sands, the most famous sacrifice zone on Earth. And when they resisted the total annihilation of their land, their air, their water, their source of food, their history, their culture, the Canadian government deemed their resistance illegal, and it still does, even in this time of climate emergency. This is the conceptual erasure of people and culture in a sacrifice zone. It's collateral damage, if we're going to use another war term. Ignored, deemed irrelevant, compared to the greater good of profits and power. Now, how does fashion intersect with sacrifice zones? Almost all of our food, housing, cars, energy, mobile phones, computers, you name it, are currently produced by benefiting from sacrifice zones. Rolando Vasquez refers to the challenge of living an ethical life. He uses the example of purchasing a simple chocolate bar for our pleasure and how it brings harm to somebody in someplace else. Fast fashion is just like all those other amenities and objects. It benefits from sacrifice zones. Think of materials, the cotton that's produced in agribusiness. Think of how the cotton plantations in the US were made use of slave labor and expelled indigenous populations from the land. Note that in the customary framework of fashion sustainability, there's mention of the amount of water, the pesticides, the herbicides used to produce the cotton, but nothing about the implications for peoples and cultures who once inhabited the land or are brought in to do the work. That's a conceptual erasure. The same applies to synthetic fibers, where billions of barrels of oil are needed every year to produce the fibers that we have in our clothes nowadays. Similarly, fast fashion makes use of displaced peoples for cheap labor. In 2014, there were 60 million people, mostly women in the global South, working in the garment industry. I don't know what percentage constitutes displaced persons, but it's extremely high. We need to ask, what has gone on in their lives that they're willing to submit themselves to the slavery of garment manufacturing? The ranks of displaced peoples is swelling rapidly in the world due to climate change, war, sacrifice zones, land degradation in general. All of these things are pushing people off their lands in increasing numbers, and the ranks of jobless in the cities is swelling. The customary framework for examining fashion labor focuses on wages and working conditions. but there's a much larger systemic whole that needs to come into view. I argue that restricting the focus to pay and working conditions is also a form of conceptual erasure. The fast fashion industry is no benefactor, generously allowing workers an income, which is how we like to see it very often. In fact, it's taking advantage of the destruction of the local and indigenous lives to produce cheap clothing. So fast fashion is complicit in the use, expansion, and condoning of sacrifice zones. And this is part and parcel of systemic capitalist exploitation. It benefits hugely from sacrifice zones. I see my time is really running out, isn't it, for this question? But with your blessing, I'll proceed.
You have my blessing, Sandra, because
Thank
I
you.
do not want to interrupt you.
Okay, thank you. Garment workers, the term is in itself a conceptual erasure because we narrow garment workers down to elements in an economic system stripped of their other human features. And last, I want to look at the fact that the fast fashion industry creates sacrifice zones. This has been fully overlooked until now by fashion sustainability activists and theorists. I'm hereby making the argument that the concept of sacrifice zones is perceived far too narrowly. Furthermore, the sustainability framework has to broaden to include not just biodiversity, but also humans and cultural diversity. The conceptual erasures within the sustainability framework are related to the erasures built into customary fashion theory. I don't have time to get into all the mechanics of how fast fashion results in the destruction of culture, but briefly I want to say that during my anthropological fieldwork in Indonesia, I witnessed the decline of indigenous cultures and their clothing systems. When young women leave their villages to go to work in factories, they leave behind their families, their languages, their way of life, their culture, their rituals, their customs, their clothing traditions. And when you perceive the complexity of the making of their clothing in their own culture, such as with weaving, it quickly becomes clear that age-old, extremely sophisticated, culturally embedded skills are being lost to do mind-numbing, unfulfilling work in factories. As individuals, as garment workers, they become de-skilled. Their cultural talents and skills are wasted. They're preyed upon in factory settings by male bosses and management in general. Poor pay and bad working conditions are just symptomatic of that. Their humanity is dispensed with, they're being wasted and destroyed. And I would argue that these laborers are also a sacrifice zone. I didn't mention that in my article, but I've come to that conclusion since then. Their cultures are being drained. The loss of ethnic diversity is a global crisis as well, but it's not receiving the attention that the environmental crisis is receiving. This is another facet of conceptual erasure. Cultural loss includes the disappearance of epistemologies, ways of thinking and understanding the world. And it includes indigenous and local clothing systems, including design, techniques, styles, and tangible cultural heritage. It includes local knowledge of the physical environment needed to make those clothing. It involves the destruction of identity and simultaneously erodes social and political stability. And the loss of culture creates social time bombs. Think of the calls by cultural activists that languages and cultures are disappearing. Wikipedia tells us that 7,000 languages spoken worldwide were present in the early 2000s, and it predicts that 90% will be extinct within the next 30 years. That process of death is what I've been witnessing in my own little corner in Indonesia. And fast fashion is complicit in this. Until now, fashion theorists have failed to connect those dots. That, I argue, is conceptual erasure. Fashion is like the forest industry. We chop down forests to make toothpicks and toilet paper, destroying them to make money, so we end up with lots of money and increasingly little of value. And fast fashion, we make articles of clothing with no value, and in the process, we destroy traditions and cultures in the world, including clothing traditions of great value. So all of those conceptual erasures that I've mentioned until now, a huge heap of them, they're just erasure upon erasure, like Russian dolls, erasures within erasures. This is what made it so hard for me to write that article. I had to pierce all those different erasures and allow my brain to work along avenues that it normally doesn't work along. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Erica. I think it wasn't what you were expecting, but there it is.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It's so impressive how you can put so much information in such a short period of time, but it's so incredibly dense and rich. And yet, in a way, if you like, so simple in the sense of the conceptual erasure. It all, as you say, comes down to that one brutal, violent mechanism. Wow, I still have to process a lot of it. I think I'm just gonna compress my question, because I had one question as well, but I think I'm just gonna point out a few things, and then we might take it into the breakout rooms all together and then maybe discuss it. Because some of the very obvious mechanisms of erasure is also a way of making us, whatever, the global north, feel less bad or even good about it, right? And you mention a few, like, you know, the typical one, at least it gives them an income. I think that's a very common one whenever we get to talk about this brutal and violent dynamics of erasure. And another one that I'd really like us to talk about is this, how do you say that, fashion, contemporary fashion saving, or a means of saving crafts, rescuing crafts, you know, by incorporating them, you know, contemporary or Western, you know, big names, fashion designers going into small villages, you know, as some sort of savior of these crafts, whereas you, I think, very well actually explain what that actually does and what the outcome is actually, this waste that you're telling about, this loss of, but also, yeah, this loss especially of dignity, right? You're calling it like cultural intellect and, you know, cultural epistemologies, but also the dignity of people. You called it, I think you said, about humanity. I think that is so incredibly strong. But yeah, and I mean, I was gonna finish or wrap up my question with how to even start and eliminate these sacrifice zones of fashion, but I think I'm not sure we're going to be able to even start with the first steps in this session. But anyway, I would like to put it out there. We are going to go into the breakout rooms now, and we'll be back after half an hour, and then at least, you know, maybe Sandra, you can give it a little try and give us a few maybe pointers in the right direction of how we can even start, maybe even on individual levels, of how we can start, you know, at least in the best case, maybe slowing down these erasures, if not, you know, completely stop these erasures. Anyway, so to the breakout room. So as you all know, this will take a few minutes, not a few minutes, but it can take a little bit. So don't panic. It will take a little bit of time before you are appointed to the breakout room. So you don't
Angela,
have to.
could you repeat the question again? Sorry to interrupt, but I'm thinking that maybe there needs to be a bit more clarity there for the people, what they're supposed to be discussing in their breakout rooms.
Yeah, so I would like, so I pointed out, I think, like 3 topics maybe. So the first one is, at least it gives them an income. The second one is contemporary fashion as a savior of crafts in these very vulnerable spaces, economies. And then the third one, where do we even begin on individual levels to at least slow down the conceptual erasure, if not end the conceptual erasure, and eliminate the sacrifice zones of fashion. Okay, Shayna, can you maybe take us to the breakout rooms?